December 8, 1942. Guadalcanal, South Pacific Dock. The rain fell in sheets across the jungle canopy, drumming against broad leaves with a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing to the men dug into the muddy earth. In a captured American foxhole along the Lunga perimeter, Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto sat with his back against the collapsing dirt wall, his uniform rotting against his skin, his rifle slick with moisture that never dried. He had not eaten a full meal in 11 days. His hands trembled as he turned over the small rectangular tin he'd found buried in the abandoned position, not from anticipation, but from the systematic breakdown of his body. The label was incomprehensible, printed in the aggressive angular letters of the enemy's language, but there was a picture: meat, pink and glistening, impossibly fresh-looking, pressed into a perfect geometric brick. In the corner, bold yellow letters spelled out a word that would echo across the Pacific theater in whispers of disbelief. Spam. Yamamoto's first thought, the one that came before hunger or curiosity, was that it must be a propaganda trick. Japanese soldier in 1942 carried with him not just the weight of his equipment, but the burden of an ideology that had been carefully constructed over decades. He had been taught that the Americans were soft, decadent, spiritually hollow, that their mechanized warfare was the product of industrial excess, not warrior spirit, that their wealth was a symptom of moral weakness. Every Japanese serviceman had been raised on the Bushido code, on stories of samurai who could endure any hardship, who found strength in deprivation, who transformed suffering into spiritual purity. And central to this belief system was the understanding of food, or rather, the noble absence of it. The Imperial Japanese Army operated on a logistical philosophy that Western military analysts would later describe as optimistic to the point of delusion. A Japanese soldier's daily ration, when it arrived at all, consisted of rice, barley, pickled radish, and occasionally small dried fish. The prescribed ration was 850 grams of rice per day, but by late 1942, with supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, most frontline troops received less than half that amount. On Guadalcanal, many received nothing at all for weeks at a time. This was not seen as a failure. This was endurance. This was purity. Japanese military training emphasized Seishin spiritual strength as superior to material resources. Recruits were systematically starved during training to build mental fortitude. Officers spoke reverently of the winter war exercises where men learned to function on a handful of rice per day. The underlying message was clear. Physical comfort was Western weakness. True warriors transcended the needs of the flesh. And then they met America's Quartermaster Corps. The United States military-industrial complex approached warfare like an engineering problem with an unlimited budget. By 1942, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had become the largest food procurement and distribution system in human history. They calculated that an American soldier in active combat required 4,000 to 4,500 calories per day. They developed an entire science around combat nutrition, factoring in not just caloric content, but protein ratios, vitamin supplementation, psychological comfort, and taste preference. The contrast was not subtle. It was CIVI, OIZATI, ONL.spam, a humble, much maligned brick of spiced ham, represented something the Japanese military command had fundamentally miscalculated. It wasn't just food. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial capacity. The ability to produce 12 million cans per week, to ship them across 2 oceans, to ensure that even the most isolated marine outpost had access to protein that wouldn't spoil in tropical heat, not to a starving Japanese soldier. Finding a can of Spam was like discovering evidence of an alien civilization. Yamamoto stared at the tin in his hands. The metal was perfect, no rust, no damage, precisely manufactured. The label was glossy, colorful, seemingly printed yesterday despite the mud and rain. Even the can itself felt impossibly substantial, the aluminum thick and sturdy. Everything about it screamed excess, waste, abundance. It had to be fake. This wasn't paranoia. This was logical deduction based on everything Yamamoto knew about war. Japanese propaganda had been explicit. America was losing. Their economy was crumbling under the weight of fighting on two fronts. Their soldiers were poorly trained conscripts who missed their mothers. Their supply lines were vulnerable. The decisive naval victories at Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific campaigns proved Japanese superiority. And yet here, in his hands, was evidence that suggested something else entirely. A Japanese soldier's suspicion of American rations went deeper than simple disbelief. It touched on a profound cognitive dissonance that would only grow more severe as the war progressed. The Imperial Command had built their entire strategic doctrine on the assumption of American material limitations. They calculated that the U.S. couldn't possibly sustain its industrial output while feeding its military. They believed that long supply lines would force the Americans into the same desperate scarcity that Japanese forces experienced. They were catastrophically wrong. But in December 1942, in that flooded foxhole, Yamamoto didn't yet understand the scale of his command's miscalculation. He only knew that the can in his hands didn't match the reality he'd been promised. So he did what thousands of Japanese soldiers would do when confronted with captured American rations. He assumed it was theater, dummy supplies, morale warfare. Perhaps the Americans left these perfect-looking cans in abandoned positions to demoralize Japanese troops when they inevitably turned out to be empty or filled with sawdust. It was the kind of psychological trick that made sense, create the appearance of abundance to mask actual scarcity. Yamamoto looked at the can for a long time, running his skeletal fingers over the smooth metal. His stomach had stopped hurting 3 days ago, which he knew was a bad sign. The pain had been replaced by a hollow numbness, a disconnection between his mind and his body that made simple actions feel like they were happening to someone else around him. The jungle breathed with malevolent life. Guadalcanal had earned its nickname among the Japanese, Island of Death, not just because of the combat, but because the island itself seemed designed to break men. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, infected wounds that turned gangrenous in the constant moisture. Men died from simple cuts. They died from infected insect bites. They died from drinking water contaminated by their own waste because they were too weak to dig proper latrines. And mostly, they died from starvation. The medical records that survived the Guadalcanal campaign reveal the brutal arithmetic of Japanese logistics. Autopsy reports of Japanese soldiers killed in late 1942 consistently showed body weights 30 to 40% below healthy levels. Intestinal parasites were universal. Beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency, was epidemic. Men's night vision failed from vitamin A deficiency. Their gums bled from scurvy. Doctors documented cases of soldiers becoming temporarily blind from protein starvation. This was not the glorious warrior's death that Bushido promised. This was biological systems shutting down, one function at a time. Yamamoto knew other men in his unit had begun eating grass, tree bark, leather equipment. There were rumors never spoken directly, but understood about what happened to the bodies of soldiers who died away from witnesses. The official term was war atrocity committed by the enemy, but everyone understood that starvation drove men past the boundaries of everything they thought was human. He looked at the spam can again. The small metal key was still attached to the bottom, ingeniously welded to a strip that wound around the lip. Yamamoto had never seen anything like it. Japanese military supplies came in crude wooden boxes or cloth bags. Nothing was individually packaged. Nothing was designed for convenience. The very concept of a self-contained, individually portioned ration that came with its own opening mechanism was alien. It was too elaborate to be fake. His hands moved before his rational mind caught up. He peeled back the metal strip, the tin unzipping in a perfect spiral with a sound like tearing silk. The seal broke with a soft pop, and the smell hit him like a physical force. Salt, fat, meat, Yamamoto's salivary glands, dormant for so long. He'd forgotten they existed, suddenly activated with painful intensity. His mouth flooded. His vision tunneled. Every nerve in his body that had been slowly shutting down roared back to life with a single message. Eat. But still, he hesitated, because the meat inside was impossible. It emerged from the can as a single perfect block, pale pink with a subtle gelatin coating, textured and firm. No maggots, no discoloration, no smell of rot. It looked exactly like the picture on the label, which itself was impossible. Food didn't look like pictures. Food spoiled, degraded, became something else in the heat and moisture. Unless you were America. The United States military's relationship with canned meat predated the war by decades. But it was Spam, specifically, that became the symbol of American logistics supremacy. Developed by Hormel Foods in 1937, Spam was essentially shoulder pork and ham, ground, spiced with salt, sugar, and sodium nitrite, then pressure cooked inside the can. The process killed bacteria, created an airtight seal, and produced a product with a shelf life measured in years, not days. More importantly, it was designed for industrial-scale production. Hormel's Austin, Minnesota plant could produce 15 million cans per year by 1941. When war broke out, that capacity expanded exponentially. By 1943, they were producing more than 100 million cans annually. The U.S. military purchased over 150 million pounds of Spam during the war, more than 12 pounds for every American serviceman. The Japanese military had nothing comparable. Their preserved foods were simple: dried fish, pickled vegetables, miso paste. These required preparation, water, cooking. Spam required nothing. You could eat it cold, hot, raw, fried. You could eat it in a typhoon, in a foxhole taking artillery. Fire while running between positions. It was pure fuel, requiring zero support infrastructure. To the Japanese military strategist, this should have been impossible. Their entire war plan depended on the assumption that American logistics would collapse under the pressure of Pacific distances. Japan's early victories had been predicated on seizing resource-rich territories and establishing interior supply lines. They calculated that the U.S. would struggle to project power across 5,000 miles of ocean while maintaining their European commitments. They failed to account for the fundamental difference in industrial philosophy. Japan's industrial economy was sophisticated, but ultimately constrained by limited raw materials and a production methodology that prioritized quality over quantity. The concept of good enough didn't exist in Japanese military manufacturing. Everything was hand-fitted, precision-crafted, made to last. America's industrial philosophy was the opposite. Make it simple, make it cheap, make 10 million of them. If it breaks, throw it away and grab another. The Sherman tank was inferior to the Japanese Type 97 in almost every technical specification, but America built 50,000 Shermans to Japan's 5,000 Type 97s. The numbers didn't matter until the numbers were everything. Spam was the food equivalent of this philosophy. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't traditional. It was protein and calories in a can that could be manufactured faster than the enemy could destroy it. Yamamoto cut a small piece with his bayonet. The meat sliced cleanly, another impossible detail. Rotten food didn't cut. It tore, fell apart, oozed. This held its shape. The texture was firm, almost springy. He put it in his mouth. The first taste was salt overwhelming, almost painful in its intensity. His depleted system, desperate for electrolytes, responded with an almost narcotic rush. Then came the fat, coating his tongue, his throat, triggering pleasure receptors that had gone silent. The umami richness of the pork activated taste buds he'd forgotten existed. His jaw ached as he chewed, muscles atrophied from weeks of liquid rice gruel suddenly. Required to do mechanical work, he swallowed. The meat went down. His stomach cramped immediately. Too rich, too much, too fast. But he didn't care. It was real. This moment of recognition repeated in thousands of similar encounters across the Pacific represented a turning point more significant than any tactical victory. Because in that instant, Yamamoto understood that everything he'd been told was a lie. Not just propaganda exaggeration. Not just optimistic miscalculation. Fundamental, civilizational lies about the nature of the war, the strength of the enemy, the inevitable victory that was promised. If the Americans could put this in a can, individually, for every single soldier, and ship it across an ocean, and leave it behind in abandoned foxholes, because they had so much it wasn't worth carrying. What else had the high command gotten wrong? The psychological impact of captured American rations on Japanese troop morale was documented throughout the war, though often in fragments, diary entries, interrogation reports, post-war interviews. The pattern was consistent. Disbelief followed by consumption, followed by profound demoralization. A Japanese officer captured on Saipan in 1944 told interrogators, "We knew we were beaten when we saw what you threw away. Your garbage had more food than our supply depot." A diary recovered from a Japanese position on Iwo Jima contained the entry, "Found American rations today. Chocolate, canned fruit, cigarettes, all fresh. How can we fight an enemy who treats war like a picnic?" The contrast extended far beyond. Spam. American field rations in 1942 included canned fruit, coffee, sugar, cocoa powder, hard candy, chewing gum, and cigarettes. The key ration, the standard issue field meal, came in 6 different menus to provide variety. The concept of menu rotation for enlisted men would have seemed absurd to Japanese quartermasters who considered themselves successful if they could deliver any food at all. But it was spam specifically that became mythological. Its very indestructibility made it symbol rather than just sustenance. Japanese soldiers began referring to it as the pink demon, both for its color and for what it represented. An enemy who could manufacture abundance where abundance should not exist. Yamamoto ate half the can before his stomach rebelled. He dry heaved into the mud, his body unable to process the richness after weeks of starvation. But he didn't throw it away. He wrapped the remainder carefully in a piece of cloth torn from his shirt, tucking it into his pack like treasure. That night, as he huddled in the flooded foxhole, he thought about the factory that must have made this. He imagined a building somewhere in America, vast and clean and brightly lit, with machines pressing out these perfect cans by the thousands. He thought about the workers who made it, who went home to houses with electricity and running water, who had probably never been hungry a day in their lives. He thought about the ship that carried it here, just one can among millions, and the other ships that must be coming, and the endless supply chain that could treat something this valuable as disposable. And he thought about the island of Japan, where his mother and sisters were living on rationed rice and sweet potato, where his father had been told to turn in his metal tools for the war effort, where every newspaper proclaimed glorious victories while the food rations got smaller. The rain continued. The jungle continued. The war continued. But something had changed in the calculus. By early 1943, the battle for Guadalcanal was effectively over. The Japanese High Command made the decision to evacuate rather than continue supplying troops on an island they could not hold. They called it a strategic repositioning. The soldiers called it what it was: retreat. Of the approximately 36,000 Japanese troops deployed to Guadalcanal, roughly 31,000 died. Disease and starvation killed 2 soldiers for every 1 killed in combat. The Americans, fighting in the same jungle under the same conditions, lost roughly 7,000 men total. The difference was not courage. Japanese forces fought with suicidal determination, launching attacks that Western military analysts considered irrational. They died by the thousands in charges against machine gun positions, refusing to surrender even when survival was impossible. The difference was logistics. The difference was the supply chain. The difference was the civilization-level capacity to manufacture, ship, and distribute resources at industrial scale. The difference was spam. In the decades following the war, historians would debate the turning points of the Pacific Campaign. Midway, where the Japanese Navy lost its carrier advantage. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots decimated Japanese air power. The submarine campaign that slowly strangled Japan's merchant marine. But there was another war happening simultaneously, less dramatic but equally decisive: the war of supply. For every headline battle, there were 1,000 logistical victories that never made newspapers' ports expanded, roads built, supply depots established, food shipped, fuel delivered, ammunition stockpiled, American forces in the Pacific consumed resources at a rate that would have bankrupted any other nation. A single infantry division required 1,500 tons of supplies per day. An aircraft carrier task force could burn through 100,000 gallons of fuel per day. The B-29 strategic bombing campaign against Japan consumed resources equivalent to feeding a city of 500,000 people, and none of it stopped. None of it slowed. The supplies kept coming with mechanical inevitability. Japanese military planners had anticipated American material advantage. They'd counted on it, in fact, as their justification for seizing resource territories quickly. What they failed to anticipate was the scale. They thought in terms of incremental superiority. America might have twice the industrial capacity, perhaps 3 times. By 1943, American industrial production exceeded the combined output of all Axis powers, not by percentage points, but by orders of magnitude. American shipyards were launching a new merchant vessel every day. American factories were producing an aircraft every 5 minutes. American farms were generating surpluses that could feed their military, their civilians, and half of Britain simultaneously. Spam production alone, just one product from one company, could have fed the entire Imperial Japanese Army. The Japanese soldiers' assumption that spam was fake was not stupidity. It was rational extrapolation from incomplete information. Everything in their cultural and military experience suggested that such abundance was impossible. The very concept violated their understanding of how war worked, how supply chains functioned, how nations allocated scarce resources. They were fighting an industrial revolution with an agricultural economy. They were fighting the 20th century with 19th century logistics. They were fighting mathematics with courage, and mathematics was winning. Yamamoto survived Guadalcanal. He was evacuated in the nighttime withdrawal of February 1943, one of approximately 11,000 Japanese troops successfully rescued from the island. He weighed 84 pounds, down from his enlistment weight of 142. He could no longer walk without assistance. His teeth were loose from scurvy. He would spend 4 months in a military hospital in Rabaul, recovering enough strength to return to combat duty. He never forgot the spam. In his post-war testimony, recorded decades later, he described it as The moment he knew Japan would lose, not could lose, would lose, the certainty was absolute. Because if the enemy could manufacture that, could ship that, could distribute that to the lowest private in the remotest foxhole, then all the warrior. Spirit in the world meant nothing. You couldn't outfight a factory. You couldn't outbrave a supply chain. You couldn't defeat an enemy who treated food as a logistics problem that had already been solved. His testimony was part of a larger pattern. Across thousands of interviews with Japanese veterans, the same themes emerged. Shock at American material. Abundance. The gradual realization that the war was unwinnable. The devastating psychological impact of understanding that their sacrifices were futile, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked production capacity. The spam became shorthand for this revelation. It appeared in diaries, letters, memoirs, always with the same mixture of disbelief and bitter recognition. The pink brick of meat represented everything Japan couldn't do. Mass production, efficient preservation, global distribution, casual. Abundance. By war's end, American forces had consumed more than 150 million cans of spam. It had been shipped to every theater of war, from the Arctic to the tropics. Soviet forces received it through Lend-Lease. British troops aided in North Africa. It fed resistance fighters in occupied Europe. It became so ubiquitous that soldiers complained about it, joked about it, swore they'd never eat it again once they got home. The ability to complain about abundance was itself a form of privilege that Japanese forces never experienced. In the final year of the war, as American forces island hopped toward Japan, they repeatedly encountered the same pattern. Fierce initial resistance, followed by the discovery of Japanese positions where soldiers had starved to death at their guns. Bunkers, filled with corpses that showed no signs of combat wounds, just the systematic shutdown of bodies that had consumed themselves. Medical examination revealed stomach contents of grass, tree bark, and in some cases, nothing at all. Meanwhile, American forward positions were supplied by airdrops if ground transport wasn't available. Planes dumped crates of rations alongside. Ammunition, often in such quantities that perishable items were discarded uneaten. The waste was strategic. Better to oversupply than risk undersupply, and America had the production capacity to make waste irrelevant. The final grotesque irony came in August 1945. As American occupation forces entered Japan, they brought with them the same logistical system that had won the war. Food shipments arrived to prevent mass starvation in the defeated nation. Among those shipments, spam, Japanese civilians, many on the edge of famine after years of failed rice harvests and blockade, received cans of the same pink meat that had haunted their soldiers' nightmares. The Tokyo Ration Board distributed it alongside rice and vegetables. Instructions were printed in Japanese: how to open the can, how to prepare it, how to incorporate it into traditional dishes. The occupier feeding the occupied with the same food that symbolized their defeat. History has rarely been so brutally poetic. Yamamoto, by then a civilian living in the ruins of Hiroshima, received his first peacetime can of spam in October 1945. He stared at it for a long time. This familiar, impossible object, now arriving not as capture but as charity. He thought about the foxhole on Guadalcanal. He thought about the men who hadn't survived, who had died believing the lies about American weakness and inevitable Japanese victory. He opened the can and ate it, because he was hungry, and it was food, and the war was over. But he tasted it differently now. Without the desperate edge of starvation, he could evaluate it objectively. It was salty, fatty, processed, industrial. It was not particularly good, not by any culinary standard. It was functional protein, efficiently packaged. And that was precisely the point. The genius of spam was not that it was delicious. It wasn't. The genius was that deliciousness was irrelevant. It solved the logistics problem. It provided calories and protein in a package that wouldn't spoil, that required no preparation, that could survive any climate. It was the food equivalent of the atomic bomb, a triumph of industrial chemistry applied to practical problems. Unconcerned with elegance or tradition, Japan had lost the war to spam before the first shot was fired. They just didn't know it until they tasted it. The symbolic resonance of spam extended well beyond the Pacific theater. It became embedded in post-war culture as a marker of American pragmatism, simultaneously celebrated and mocked, ubiquitous and reviled. It fed nations recovering from war. It became a staple in Hawaii, where military presence turned it into a beloved local food. It entered the language as metaphor, its very name becoming shorthand for mass-produced disposability. But in the specific context of the Pacific War, spam's meaning was darker and more profound. It represented the collision between industrial modernity and traditional military culture. It was the physical proof that ideology cannot overcome production, that spiritual strength cannot substitute for supply chains, that courage means nothing when the enemy can bury you in material. The Japanese military had built its doctrine on the belief that superior spirit could compensate for material disadvantage. They had convinced themselves that American wealth was weakness, that comfort bred cowardice, that hardship was purifying. They sent their soldiers to war with minimal supplies and maximum expectations, believing that deprivation built character and victory. They were wrong in every particular. American soldiers weren't weaker for being well fed. They were stronger. They fought harder, longer, more effectively because they had the calories to sustain combat. They didn't waste mental energy on survival because their logistics system handled survival automatically. They could focus entirely on combat because everything else was already taken care of. The American military discovered what every modern army would eventually learn. Logistics is strategy. Supply is victory. The side that can feed, fuel, and equip its forces reliably will defeat the side that cannot, regardless of tactical prowess or ideological conviction. Spam was the weapon America deployed before the shooting started. By the time Japanese soldiers encountered it in captured foxholes, the war was already lost. They just didn't have the information to realize it yet. Years after the war, military historians analyzing Japanese strategic planning identified a consistent pattern: systematic underestimation of American industrial capacity. Every calculation, every projection, every war game assumed American limits that didn't exist. They planned for a war where resources were scarce, supply was difficult, and abundance was impossible. They lost to a nation where abundance was the default state, where scarcity was the anomaly that required explanation. They lost to a civilization that could manufacture its way out of any problem, that could throw production at logistics until logistics ceased to be a constraint. They lost to spam and everything it represented. In the decades following the war, spam became something of a joke in American culture, the subject of Monty Python sketches, a symbol of lowbrow cuisine, the food you ate only if nothing better was available. Geese who had eaten it for years swore they'd never touch it again, but in Japan, it retained a different meaning. In Okinawa, where American occupation introduced it, spam became a treasured ingredient, incorporated into traditional dishes, sold in premium gift boxes, treated with genuine culinary respect. The same was true in Hawaii, Korea, the Philippines. Everywhere American military presence had distributed it, the foods that nourished America's warriors became staples in the nations. They occupied, transformed from military ration to cultural artifact. The taste of occupation became the taste of memory, complicated and impossible to separate from history. Yamamoto lived until 1992. long enough to see Japan rebuilt into an economic superpower, long enough to see his grandchildren grow up in prosperity. That would have seemed impossible in 1945. He rarely spoke about the war, like many veterans of losing armies. Shame, trauma, and the desire to forget made silence preferable to remembering. But occasionally, when prompted by researchers or family, he would tell the story of the spam, the aluminum tin in the flooded foxhole, the perfect pink brick. The moment of understanding that everything he believed was wrong. He would describe the taste salt and fat and impossible freshness, and how it had taught him more about modern war than all his military training. How it had shown him that the 20th century belonged to nations that could manufacture, distribute, and supply at industrial scale. How it had revealed that his sacrifice, and the sacrifice of millions like him, had been wasted in service of a strategy that could never succeed. And then he would fall silent again, because some truths are too large for language, too painful for continuous examination. The aluminum key that opened the spam can was a trivial innovation, a simple manufacturing detail, meaningless in isolation. But it represented a philosophy. Make things easy, make things convenient, make things efficient. Eliminate friction. Automate solutions. Turn complexity into simplicity through design. That philosophy won the Pacific War. Not heroism, not tactics, not strategy design. The design of supply chains, production systems, logistics networks. The design of food preservation, manufacturing, distribution protocols. The design of a civilization that could mobilize its productive capacity and project it across oceans. With mechanical reliability, Japan fought with courage. America fought with factories. The outcome was never in doubt. Once you understood what was actually being measured, Private Yamamoto turned the aluminum key in a foxhole on Guadalcanal, and the seal broke with a soft pop, and inside was abundance, where abundance should not exist. That moment, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific, was the real battlefield. Not Iwo Jima, not Okinawa, not any of the blood-soaked islands that filled the history books. The real battle was production versus ideology, industrial capacity versus spiritual strength. The machine versus the warrior. And the machine won, because the machine always wins. Because mathematics is indifferent to courage, and production scales without limit, and you cannot fight logistics with Bushido. The pink brick of meat sat in its perfect aluminum coffin, and it told the truth that no propaganda could erase. America's wealth was not weakness. It was the weapon, the decisive weapon. The only weapon that mattered. Everything else was just details. The necessary but insufficient violence that filled the gap between recognition and surrender. The actual war was won in factories in Austin, Minnesota, where machines pressed ham and pork into cans at a rate of thousands per hour, destined for soldiers who would eat them without thought, without appreciation, without understanding that they were consuming victory itself. Spam was fake, but only in the sense that it represented a reality so foreign, so abundant, so impossible that Japanese soldiers could not integrate it into their worldview without shattering everything they believed about the war, their mission, and their inevitable triumph. When they finally tasted it, when the salt and fat flooded their systems and their bodies remembered what food could be, that shattering was complete. War was lost the moment the first Japanese soldier bit into captured spam and realized it was real. Everything after was epilogue.